Well, hello and welcome to a bonus episode of 15-Minute Theology. My name is Tyler Burton, and ordinarily, this is a podcast covering the central truths of the Christian faith in 15 minutes-ish. But today, we are doing something very different. On this bonus episode, we are actually going to be aiming for a little bit longer than the typical time period of 15 minutes. During the normal season, we'll cover high doctrines in a short amount of time to make it where it is accessible and comprehensive at the same time. But for a bonus episode in between season 1 and season 2, I really want to get a chance to have a longer form conversation on what on earth does our theology have to do with how we live? And to help me have a conversation around these lines is somebody who is incredibly passionate about both theology, how doctrine plays itself out, and ethics, how we live. So joining me in this way more than 15-minute theology episode is Bradford Littlejohn. Brad, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Tyler.
Absolutely. I'm glad to have you on. I've been following your work for quite some time, so really excited to have you on for this.
Yeah, our pleasure.
Awesome. Well, let's do this. Before we hop into our content, we got a little time. You know, we can lay back, relax. We don't have to feel like we're under the clock. Can you give us a brief introduction of who you are? Give us a little bit about Brad, besides the most theologian-sounding theologian name I've ever heard, which is Bradford Littlejohn. That's pretty fantastic.
Yeah, originally W. Bradford Littlejohn was my authorial name for a while, and I finally decided it was a little too pretentious, so just went with the Bradford. And sometimes just Brad now, but
pretty excellent nonetheless, man. You got set up for a win.
Well, thanks. So, I live in upstate South Carolina. This is where I grew up. I moved away to college and came back 17 years later and live in the house that my parents built, so it's pretty cool.
No way.
Yeah. So I got passionate about theology. Actually, here on this property, my dad hired a local Greenville seminary student to do landscaping work on our property, and he figured it was good for me to get off my ass, stop reading books all the time, and do some sweating. So I went out and helped this seminary student around the property, and in the process, we talked about theology questions, which I'd read a little bit of theology. I was mostly a history buff, and I was planning to become a history professor one day. But through those years of kind of being informally mentored while clearing trails, I got more and more passionate about theology, and ended up pursuing a PhD in theological ethics at the University of Edinburgh, which I completed in 2013. But I was very frustrated by the disconnect between a lot of academic theological study and the life of the church. And so I was kind of, as I was wrapping that up, I was looking for other opportunities besides the usual academic job market, which was a terrible job market anyway. So I ended up starting my own organization, the Davenant Institute, 10 years ago this weekend, actually. So I don't know when this episode is being released, but September 9th is our 10th anniversary. So we're doing a little anniversary party in DC. But so we started that. I started that 10 years ago in order to really build a bridge between the academy and the church, helping make the really important retrieval work that was being done in Protestant theology available to a much broader swath of pastors and Christian leaders. So, yeah, and that's what I've been doing part-time until a year and a half ago, or at least officially part-time. I may have had 2 full-time jobs part of the time, but
that's how it goes
anyway,
sometimes.
Officially full-time president of Davenant for the last year and a half now. So,
come on, well, congratulations. That's a big deal. And then I really love that your story of theological education really roots itself in discipleship. It's this house you're currently in, your father and mother built, and that's part of your discipleship under their love and tutelage. Yep. And then also a seminary student coming along and just informally mentoring you, bringing you along, and that just kind of was the Lord's providence in carrying you forward. What a remarkable example of God's care to you in that. It's amazing.
And that's part of what we try to carry that on here at Davenant House, which is here on the property. So when we have students come for their discipleship weeks or for our intensive summer programs, that going out and working on the garden together and talking theology while we work with our hands is a key part of the program. So
Yeah, I love that. That's really amazing. Very Bonhoeffer-esque in
yeah,
the seminary style. That's incredible. So if you're listening and you're looking for formal, informal, I've taken classes through Davenant Institute. They do some really great stuff. So excited to have you on Brad. 10th anniversary. That's really encouraging, man. That's great stuff. Well, let's do this. Let's kind of take a second and turn then into this passion you have for theology, ethics, the church, and discipleship into a brief conversation for today. One thing I love about your story is that the entirety of your ministry now, your family life, your discipleship to Jesus is really reflecting how not only has Jesus shaped your heart, but shaped the entirety of your life. Your doctrine then is kind of carrying itself out in the things you're doing and the way you're living. So you were the one who, when we were talking about this, you said, actually, I think I could really talk on this interplay between theology and ethics. So I'm curious, for you in particular, what is it that interests you about not just talking about the beautiful doctrines, but how does this beautiful doctrine actually play out in how we live?
yeah. Well, I think because we are image bearers of God, um, we will be living out our theology, whether we realize it or not. We will always be trying to bear the image of whatever we think God is.
Yeah.
Um, if we truly know and love the Creator God, then we will find ourselves seeking to conform more and more to His image, to live in a way that it reflects that. Uh,
Yeah.
if we're worshiping some idol, we're going to structure our lives around obedience to that idol. We're going to look more and more like that thing that we idolize. So I think there's this there's going to be this coherence between them. Our beliefs are going to play themselves out in our actions. But I think it's more complicated than that, of course, because and this is, I think, what makes it so interesting is that we can believe something. Our beliefs. We can have beliefs on many different levels of consciousness, right? And so we can believe something in theory that hasn't really come to the center of our being. So we can have a good theology up here that hasn't really taken its seat in our heart.
Yeah.
And then, therefore, we might be living in a way that doesn't reflect those beliefs. So that can be, you can have good beliefs and still have bad actions, but it can also go the other way. And I think this is, where Paul talks about in Romans 2 about God's law being written on our hearts, even on the hearts of the Gentiles, where even those who have a false theology, who are worshiping false gods, there is still sort of buried deep beneath that an awareness of who the true God is, which Paul talks about in Romans 1, right? Although they knew God, right? They suppressed that truth, but they knew God. And so that deeply buried belief and the reality of God as he impresses himself in the created order, right? He's made himself known through the things that were made, as it says in Romans 1.
Mm-hmm.
That means that even the person who has a false God nonetheless has some awareness of the true God underneath, which means that their ethics may not be as bad as their theology, right? They might, in some ways, you can have good theology and not fully live it out, or you can have really bad theology and thankfully not fully live it out. And so there's always going to be, they're kind of, the more thoughtfully you live your life, the closer they're going to come together. And yet there's always going to be these interesting tensions and inconsistencies.
Yeah. I think you helpfully also pointed out some of the kind of roots of unbelief that happen in the heart. In reality, when we're running into spaces where our ethics and our theology aren't in line, what's happening is there might be a false worship happening, or there might be a false understanding of how worship is to play itself out. And that can not only happen in us, but I think also help us in our conversations with friends who don't believe the gospel as well. They might say, of course I believe in Jesus, but then when you press on that little idol, right? When you press on that idol of the thing they're actually worshiping, it shows itself. It reveals itself to not be the case. Yeah, it's really helpful. That was really helpful. So then, all right, here's the thing. I took ethics in college and I took ethics in seminary. And I think one of the first things that was the difference between the ethics I took in college and the ethics I took in seminary. Is in college, it was all mostly political, right? It was here's the political decisions we're making. Here's kind of the ways society and culture can make ethical decisions, and there's not really a thoughtful life sitting behind it. Going into theological ethics, it's a very different way of understanding it. So, could you just define ethics for us? I know that's kind of a simple question with probably a long answer. What would you say ethics is then?
Yeah, well, I would say the most basic definition is just ethics is the study of how to live well. And I think that that has both an external and an internal dimension. I think most people would grant that there's both an external and an internal dimension, right? It can't be, ethics has to be more than just good intentions. It has to be more than just good feelings, good thoughts. It has to actually be, living that out in some kind of visible way. And yet it can't just be external either. And that's why I think, you might have that tension where studying in a more secular environment, the emphasis is going to be on the things that you do outwardly, making the world a better place. But even within a secular ethics, there generally be recognition that intention does matter. If you are making, the goal might be just making the world a better place, but it's better if you're making the world a better place because you actually love other people, as opposed to, you're trying to get, most people recognize if you're serving other people just to get praise for yourself, there's something wrong with that. So we understand that there's both this external
it's also
and
Romans
dimension.
1, like you were talking about, playing itself out, right? Like
Yeah.
even in our pursuit of things away from God, there's a sense in us that recognizes the law of God as we're playing itself out, right? Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. I think from a Christian standpoint, that internal dimension is foregrounded. That there's the recognition. Augustine famously says there can't be any true justice. So justice is giving to each what is due to them. So there can't be any true justice unless you're giving God what is his due. And therefore, all goods that you pursue must ultimately be pursued for the sake of God, because he is the greatest good. And so if you're pursuing good for any other reason, in some sense, you are pursuing evil. So having that heart relationship right with God is going to be at the root of any truly good ethical action from a theological standpoint.
It's helpful. It sees ethics as linked to worship, right? I am either doing this out of love, adoration, and worship of God, or I am doing it out of love for self, love for others, and ultimately then would it be sin, right? So ethics then is not just the action, it is the whole life and heart that goes then into the action, which I think is where theology uniquely places itself in. That theology is not a separated doctrine. We're actually dealing with what do I believe about God and his world, and what he has done in his son. So then if you could say there is one particular way in which the study of God shapes our ethics, can actually shape what it means to follow Jesus faithfully, what is one way you would say that's possible?
Yeah, well, I would start with, what I already said in terms of that the fact that we bear God's image is going to be very determinative then for how we view our ethical lives, right? So we are seeking to image God. What is this God? What is he like? And therefore, what are we supposed to be like? Well, if you have the idea of the Greek gods, that they're just kind of really powerful beings going around chasing their own passions and seeking their own glory, then you're going to think that we too are supposed to aspire to be like that. This is the world of the Iliad and the Odyssey, is the heroes seeking to. The line between humans and gods is very blurry, right? Some humans are descended from gods, some humans become gods. There's this idea that human beings do image the gods that they worship, and the gods that they worship are concerned with their own power and glory and pleasure, and that's what the Greek heroes are seeking to do. And it's interesting. It's not immoral in that world for Achilles to. My son's just been reading the Iliad, so this is very much on my mind. Right? So Achilles is basically sacrificing the interest of the rest of the Greeks to ensure that he gains as much glory as possible, and that just seems like obviously unethical to us. It's not unethical in their world because he's imaging
It's
their
exactly what
gods,
the
right?
gods do. Yeah.
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 Um, if you go, you know, okay, so that's a very crude idea of God. But even if we go a little beyond that, as long as we have this, as long as we don't have an idea of God as being infinite, an infinite creator, upon which all creation is dependent, if we don't have that idea, then we're going to see God as realizing himself, as achieving his godness in struggle, in a kind of violent struggle against that which is not God. And this is
Yeah.
the view, and most pagan religions have this idea of, there might be good
Yeah.
gods and bad gods, and the good gods are
Eastern
having to,
mysticism. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
right. There's conflict is basic to reality. Struggle, conflict, violence, overcoming through strength and violence. And so if that's who your God is, then that's what your ethic is going to be. It's going to be like the Norse. Think about the kind of the Norse worldview, right? Um, Now, okay, you don't want a God like that. So you want a God who is indeed an infinite God, who is on which all creation comes from him, is dependent upon him. But still, um, there's going to be differences between, say, the God of Islam and the God of Christianity. Because the God of Islam is an infinite creator God, but he is not law bound in his actions. So what you need is a God who is infinite vis-a-vis creation, and yet he he limits his own infinity, right? He limits himself to act in a law-bound fashion, right? So the God of Islam is all powerful. He can do whatever he wants. He can command human beings to do whatever he wants them to do, and he can change his commands whenever he wants. And
Terrifying,
so it's
by
an
the way.
absolute dictator. What?
Terrifying. That's a terrifying reality.
Yeah,
Yeah. There's
exactly.
no
And
consistency
of
there.
course, this creates a political theology. The political theology of Islam is one of, and why do most Muslim countries have dictators? Well, because the God of Islam is a dictator. The
That's a
idea of a
tremendous point.
ruler limiting himself by law is not in their theology, and so it's not in their politics. But
Yeah.
Christian theology has an absolute, infinite God who nonetheless limits himself to act in a law-bound fashion, and therefore he creates a model for human beings, his image bearers, acting in that way.
Yeah. How would you say this even goes to the modern secular gods? Right. They aren't necessarily the gods that the Greeks worshipped and the Muslim worships, but they very much are secular atheistic gods. Right. How would you say that it kind of runs afoul of the atheistic materialist system as well?
Well, I would say what we're dealing with right now is so I think the key things are to affirm are man is made in God's image, and yet there's an absolute creator-creature distinction. So man is made in God's image, but man is very much not God, right? Man is bound and limited in ways that God is not. If you don't affirm that, then you're going to take the idea that man is made in God's image, and you're going to try to make man himself into God,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
I think that's probably where we're at most of all now. I think because a lot of it has to do with technology. It seems to me, by means of our technologies, we've been able to master nature more and more and more, and then it's easy to delude ourselves into thinking, "Wow, this we can make this world into whatever we want it to be. We are effectively gods. This creation it's not God's creation; it's our creation. We can recreate it at will, and then we can even turn on ourselves and recreate our own human nature to be whatever we want it to be. And this is, I think, what you see in the kind of transgenderism movement, is this denying the limits of createdness and trying to ourselves be infinite creative beings that just, for God can imagine something and just do it, right? And we're trying to get to that point. If we can just we just need to think it up, and then technologically we can make it happen. So I would say that's where our idolatry really is coming in. The form that it takes for us now is it's very much, I mean, in some sense, every form of idolatry is a form of worship of self, but I think that's much more explicit
Today.
in our current age.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and it's striking to me how similar that result actually kind of is to the pagan God result, because in the pagan God result, you're right, they're imaging the gods, and therefore their actions that we would say are morally reprehensible are in line with the system, and it's not reprehensible. It's fine. I think it's interesting that in the pagan culture we kind of have today, the secular pluralist pagan culture, there is a sense in which if someone is doing something that's defying me and my ethical system as the center of reality, there is an ability to override them in order to have what I think is rightly mine. So because I'm the center, then the ethical system is based entirely on me as the center. Someone in the way of that then is in the wrong. The evil then is not allowing self-actualization and self-fulfillment. And so I can do that at the expense of the other, which is crazy.
I mean, it's a new polytheism, right? So why is monotheism important? Because monotheism ensures an actual shared ethical system. There is one universal set of moral norms because there's one transcendent divine being. If there are multiple divine beings that are all kind of equally ultimate, then there are multiple competing moralities, and that's the case in the ancient pagan world, and that's the case for us now
in the modern world. Yeah, that's crazy. And the competing morality is my next door neighbor, which is crazy. Super helpful, super clear. So then, thinking on Christian doctrine, the fundamental truths of what it means to follow Jesus. Are there some doctrines in following Jesus that we might not realize have an effect on our ethics, but slowly over time we can see that they do?
Yeah, I mean, I think a significant one that people may not think about that much is eschatology. A lot of us, I think, prefer to sort of not to talk about I mean, maybe people fall into two camps. Either they talk way too much about eschatology, that's all they talk about, or they don't want to talk about it at all.
Right.
And I think it's important to have a sort of a healthy agnosticism about a lot of eschatology, that we don't know the day or hour, and it's unhealthy to speculate too much. But I don't think we should totally ignore it, because I think it does have important ramifications. And I think we've seen that in the last in American evangelicalism. So
Certainly.
if you think that if your theology says things are getting worse and worse, the Antichrist is going to take over, and Jesus is going to come back really soon and rescue us out of the domain of the Antichrist, well then, what's the point of founding? I mean, why would you even waste time founding a Christian university, for instance, right? The only thing that really makes sense to do is to focus on evangelism. Save as many souls as you can, because Jesus is coming back in 5, maybe 10 years, and save a few more souls before he comes back. Whereas if you have an eschatology that has a longer time horizon and has more optimism about the extent to which Christ's kingdom will be made manifest on earth in a kind of preliminary way before he comes to reign in person. If you have that eschatology, then there's much more of a motivation to invest in intergenerational building of Christian families, Christian institutions, Christian societies. And so I think, and yet there's a temptation, of course, if you have too grandiose an eschatological vision, too much of a vision of how much Christ's kingdom can be accomplished before he returns, then there's the danger of thinking, if we build this Christian society, then that's going to be Christ's kingdom on earth, right? So I think there's this healthy balancing act where you have to have an optimism about the directionality of Christ's kingdom within this age, and yet a recognition of the limits of what we as humans can accomplish. And in any case, whatever view you take of those eschatologies, it is going to inform a rather different set of ethical priorities.
Yeah. Do you think there's wisdom then in holding loosely to something, to an eschatological system? I mean, I think that I would probably hold to I had a professor one day who said that Monday through Thursday he's on-mill, and then Friday through Sunday he's post-mill. And I really appreciated that because he recognized the level of agnosticism you have to have.
Yeah.
There is some mystery here, but he also very much held to pieces of it. And really saw the interplay between the belief there and how he carried out his world. So thoughts on that? Thoughts on kind of holding maybe a little open-handed to some of these?
I think that's true. I think you should hold it fairly loosely, and then that in fact enables you to focus on the full range of Christian duties that we're called to. If you get really confident in a particular eschatology, whether it's pessimistic or optimistic, and you think you know the answers, then on that basis you can prioritize, right? You can say, like, okay, I know that Jesus is coming back in just 10 years or so. So now, on the basis of that knowledge, I can prioritize within the New Testament commands and say, okay, that one's not very important. That one's not very important. This one is very important. Right.
Build the bunker, write the gospel track, and go from there.
Right.
Yeah.
So whereas if you hold it loosely, then you can zoom out a little bit and look at the whole picture and focus on evangelism and kingdom building. So
yeah, and then you can hold tightly to what we can affirm in that Jesus is going to return. And because he is going to return, there's a confidence, there's a rest, there's a help, there's a hopefulness, right? There's a theological optimism. The grave is empty. He's going to return. And yet, like you're saying, a level of humility. I don't know how this is going to happen. And then we can kind of sit in both of those spaces. Yeah, super helpful. So then I have a question along those lines, but it kind of comes back to what you said closer to the beginning of one of the things that interests you the most about this play between theology and ethics is that sometimes they don't align. Sometimes I might have a very strong belief, a very strong system that I hold to that doesn't actually play itself out in how I live. Or like you mentioned, I might be living a particular way and disagreeing with a set of assumptions that go underneath that living, but then in my head hold something very different. So then when that happens, because I think inevitably as a fallen creature, that's going to happen, where we notice that there is some level of inconsistency between what I say that I believe, what I believe, and how I live. How then do we deal with this? And I'm asking because I think on one end, we can be legalists. We can zero in on the duty of it. We can notice the failure. We can become scrupulous almost and just kind of constantly being overwhelmed at our deficiencies here. Or on the other end, we can maybe become antinomian and say, yeah, it doesn't really matter how much I live here. It just really matters what I believe. Or we can just kind of do some mishmash of all of it. So when we notice these things, what does it look like to actually correct the inconsistency and do so to put how we live and what we believe back into a harmonious alignment?
Yeah. So, I mean, the short answer is it depends. It depends on what the nature of
I love that.
What nature of disharmony is. Because as I said, sometimes people are in fact living. Their conduct is wiser than their beliefs, right? They can hold really bad beliefs and yet, in fact, live quite decent lives because the natural law in impressing itself on their conscience is guiding them more truly than their official beliefs are. So I would say, I think for us as Christians, I would say when you recognize that discrepancy between belief and action, when I say when you recognize it should be something you should be constantly attentive to. I think this is sort of like a daily discipline of examining yourself, and not in an unhealthy sort of paralyzing introspection, but just
not navel gazing.
Yeah, how I want to serve God as well as I can today. I know that my sin nature is going to be keep me from doing that. What are some ways in which I have, sort of habitually am failing to do that which I say that I want to do?
Yeah.
But when we notice these dissonances between our beliefs and conduct, um, the first thing to say is, as I say, it can go either way. That it probably you want to reform your conduct to match your beliefs, but possibly you need to reform your beliefs to match your conduct. Because again,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you're, what do I want to say? Like sometimes your heart knows better than your head, right? Sometimes there's a kind of a, a sanctified common sense that is better than your official theology. And if you find yourself, so particularly, I think you can, if you've adopted a very kind of rigorous legalistic theology, and then you're like, oh, I just keep falling short. I'm just not, I'm not living as faithfully as I should. Maybe you're falling short, or maybe you are living faithfully, and it's your theology that's overly scrupulous. And so,
Yeah.
and so, for instance, the people have different views on this, but I think I would say, like, what does it mean? What does it mean to keep the Sabbath in today's world? I think it's a really difficult question. I think to some extent, you should sort of not try to answer it in the abstract, but rather try to just cultivate a healthy rhythm of life with your church, with your family, around your work, and that trying to sort of live in a way that's in tune with the rhythms of life that God has called you to, may in fact be more reliable than something that you could kind of try to think through in an abstract way, right? So sometimes, so if there's a disconnect between head and heart, sometimes the heart actually knows better than the head. But
Yeah.
I think maybe more often than not, it's going to be the other way around. If by head we mean, depends what we mean by head here, but if you're reading the scriptures and praying and listening to what you're learning, what's being preached on Sunday, and you're thinking about those things and recognizing your conduct keeps going a different direction, there can be a temptation to say, well, I don't want to be inauthentic. I don't want to just be going through the motions. And so therefore, it's not, people would say it's like, if my habits aren't there, I shouldn't just force myself into living out these, going through the motions of these godly habits just because, just to conform to what I believe is right. But I would say, you can, that that the expression "fake it till you make it" is true, right? That you can, if you do recognize, you don't want to be a hypocrite just going through the motions. But if you do truly believe that this is how God wants you to live. So let's say, for instance, your prayer life, right? So this is a great example, right? So most of us probably feel like we have a pretty abysmal prayer life. And I think there can be a temptation to be like, well, I don't want to be like formalistic about it. Prayer is supposed to be spontaneous and from the heart. And so if I'm just trying to like force myself into a prayer routine, then it's not really prayer, is it? Right? It's real prayer has to just bubble up from within. Well, yeah, but sometimes you got to create, if you want water to come up out of the ground, you got to dig a well and put walls around it, and then it'll let it bubble up, right?
So good.
You don't just wait for it to bubble up on its own. And so I think that similarly, that's what we should do with our prayer lives. We need to dig a well, and put bricks around it, and keep, if it gets filled with mud, we need to dig the mud out. And what I mean by that, that's structuring our lives with set aside times, set aside and formal habits that we establish to make room for prayer. And initially, it may be just kind of going through the motions. But as we do that, as we go through those motions, and wait upon the Spirit, then those motions will become real. So I think we have a lot to learn from the historic Christian tradition of speaking about the virtues. And virtues are habits of soul in which it's not just a matter of external action, and it's not just a matter of good internal desires. It's a matter of the kind of the constant interplay of those two feeding each other, letting our desires shape our habits, and letting those habits then shape our desires.
Yeah, I liked how you started with it depends, and then fleshed out the pieces, fleshed out the different ways that could be dealt with. It's so incredibly helpful. And what I really appreciate was you kind of spoke against the idea that just doing it if you don't feel it is inauthentic. Because let's say you are in that place and you're somebody who, okay, I know I ought to be doing this, but I want to wait until I feel it. Actually, if you know you ought to be doing it and then you start living it out, that actually is authentic, right? That actually is genuine belief carrying itself forward. You might not quite want to quite yet, but you're doing what you know is to be true. And I also appreciate that you kind of defied the Selena Gomez logic of like the heart wants what it wants, right? You're not saying that, but you are saying there is a sanctified common sense. This is John in 1 John, right? Like he speaks louder than our hearts, right? The cross actually speaks against our hearts when our hearts accuse us. There's a sense in which the data of the gospel and the sanctified common sense of the gospel believed, gospel saved sinner can actually speak and correct to the incorrect things happening in the heart. And those two things happen simultaneously. It sounds like you'd really emphasize that one of the things we can do to help most align our belief systems in our living is the spiritual practices, is allowing these habits of life to begin to put all of these things together. Am I on the right track there?
Yeah, and I think a lot of that needs to be done in community, and I think that's what evangelicals probably in general are particularly lacking in. Is we may have relatively strong habits of individual Bible reading and devotion, but you mentioned Bonhoeffer at the beginning, and I've just recently read his Life Together, and it's really great how he holds together both sides. I mean, the book's called Life Together, but there's a whole section about there's a chapter called The Day Alone, and then a chapter called The Day with Others, and you need both, right? You need that time alone with God in order to be filled up by Christ, so that you can be Christ to your neighbor, and yet you also are not meant to draw strength alone. You're supposed to draw strength from your neighbor who is being Christ to you. And so establishing spiritual disciplines of life in community, which, for most of us, that means like our family community, minimally. But I think actually we need, the Anglican tradition, which is what I identify with. I say identify with it. It's very modern language, but it is true.
Yeah.
I'm a member of a Presbyterian church, but I'm more Anglican probably in orientation. But within the church, the Anglican tradition, there's the rhythms of daily morning and evening prayer were established in the Reformation, and the idea was that the entire Christian community, which everybody would have lived, within easy walking distance to the parish church, is coming together for those daily rhythms of worship. Now, I'm sure even at the heyday, it was only a small fraction of people did it, but it still was. It wasn't just Sunday morning worship; it was daily, and there was at least some portion of the community gathering as community. And I think it would be healthy for us as American Christians. It's difficult to know how to do this in our age of the automobile and people being so scattered about and having such busy lives. But the more we can form those spiritual disciplines within the rhythms of community, the better we're going to be. And that's where our theology needs to shape our ethics. The Christ doesn't redeem individuals for himself; he redeems a people, the church. And I think our culture is a deeply individualistic culture, and that has formed our ethics in the church to an unhealthy degree.
And what a countercultural witness to the modern culture when it is people in life together, following Jesus faithfully, being shaped by him, shaping one another. That's the that creates a little bit of an attractiveness, right? It's the aroma of Jesus where people see us and say, oh, I have to do something about this. Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, Brad, thank you. Thanks for your time, your answers, your insights. I've been incredibly helped by this. I think one thing I'm taking away from this is just the intersection between belief, habit, and all of life, and how really there is no way to bifurcate these. There's actually an entire uniformity in how I live what I am, how I live what I do. It's all linked together. So thank you for that, just instructing me in that. Thanks for instructing us in this as well. Hey, where can we find you? Give yourself a little bit of an advertisement. It's a much longer episode than normal, so you got a little bit more room here. If you could advertise yourself, where can we find you? Where can people hear about your work besides just coming and knocking on your door in South Carolina? What else can folks do?
Well, I did have a personal website that was so out of date that I took it offline until I have time to update it. So maybe you can check whether bradlittlejohn.com works or not by the time this episode goes live. But hopefully I can get that up to date and put all the links to all the different places I'm writing, because I write for a gazillion different places, so it is hard to find one place. But in the meantime, my Twitter, WB Littlejohn. You can find, I tweet out most things that I teach or speak or write. I teach every term for our Davenant Hall program, which so I'll be teaching topics related to this podcast, natural law and scriptural authority this fall. And then in the January through March term, we do trimesters. I'll be teaching Protestant moral theology. And then I teach Reformation in the Modern World in April through June. So, check out davenanthall.com if you want to take a course with me or any of our other great teachers. And I hope to see some of you there.
Come on. I love it. Yeah, I took the class on Owen's eschatology not too long ago, and it actually showed a lot of what you talked about how Owen's eschatology through the years shaped his political theology, shaped his everyday theology, shaped his pastoral theology. It's really, really remarkable. So it was a great course. Hey, can't recommend Davenant highly enough. They're tremendous. So Brad, thank you for your time. Thanks for this. Hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you for joining us as well. And we will see you next time on a much shorter episode of 15 Minute Theology.